If you will turn with me to Matthew 21, I'm going to read again verse 43. And this is Jesus speaking. And he says, "Therefore say I unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you, and shall be and given to a nation, bringing forth the fruits thereof." Jesus prophesied that. And where did that happen? It happened when America was born. The gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus was revealed to people after Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, and the English translated it into English, and the Scottish translated it into their language. We saw the death, burial, and resurrection, and the gospel began being preached. And those that were preached it wanted the freedom to worship God, freedom of conscience, to worship God how they saw written on these pages. And those people are the ones that came to the United States. And we started a country. I shared yesterday about the Declaration of Independence and about how it came about and how God was with us and how the ships were in the harbor when we were voting, and that they decided on the Declaration of Independence. The delegates were unanimous, deciding that the United States that they had just created was going to go against a country with insurmountable odds. And it looked like everything against us, but God was with us. And the United States was born. Now, the beginning of the country, the first 9 years, we were under the Articles of Confederation. And we found out with those 9 years that the Articles of Confederation didn't work. They weren't strong enough. We had some states that decided that, yeah, we'll give the federal government this much money, and other states said, we're not going to give you any. And then when we had to have an army, some states said, well, we'll send you this many men, and other states said, well, we're not going to send you any. And they realized that this wasn't going to work. Did you know that we had a president before Washington? Yeah, go look it up. He was president under the Articles of Confederation. Well, they decided in 1787 that they were going to have to come together and fix the Articles. So they came together and they met in Independence Hall, the same place that they signed the Declaration of Independence. And they sent delegates from each of the 13 colonies. And they started to work. It took them several weeks to even get a quorum together where they could start. But they worked for weeks, and they realized after a couple months, they can't fix the Articles of Confederation. They were going to have to put it aside, and they were going to have to start over. And when they decided this is when our Constitution started coming together.
Oh.
Now, after several weeks, they ended up with a great big argument. And the argument was the larger states, the larger colonies, wanted the representatives in the Congress. They wanted it all decided by population for voting. How many people you had in your state was how many representatives that you were going to have in the Congress. Well, the small states said, well, you're going to vote us out of everything. So they said, we didn't want that. They wanted the same number of people from each of the states to go to be part of the Congress. And it was a big argument. We think now, well, you know, it's just logical. Well, yeah, on the other side. But there they argued for weeks. And it got to the point that some of the states threatened, we're going to go home. And they realized if that was going to happen, our government was going to implode. It was going to destroy itself from the inside. And it's interesting, that day, when they realized that they were in severe trouble, Benjamin Franklin, one of the only 6 that had been there when they signed the Declaration of Independence, was also there when they were working on the Constitution. Ben Franklin at this time was 82 years old, and he wasn't doing very well health-wise, but he was part of the convention to write our Constitution. And I'm going to read you his quote. Read you what he stood up, his short speech, very short speech. But in that speech, you are going to see the spirit of America. You're going to see what God did. In fact, before we go there, I want you to go with me to Isaiah 3. I'm going to begin in verse 1. I want to show you what was in the United States when it was born. It says, for behold the Lord of hosts, this is Isaiah 3, verse 1, does take away from Jerusalem and from Judea the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread and the whole stay of water. And look at what else God took away from a people that rebelled. the mighty man, and the man of war, the judge, and the prophet, and the prudent, and the ancient, and the captain of 50, and the honorable man, and the counselor, and the cunning artificer, and the eloquent orator. Now I want you to look at that list and think about the Constitution and think about the Declaration of Independence. What was there? What did God have there as our founding fathers? He had the orator. He had the mighty man. He had the man of war. You said, who was the man of war? Have you ever looked at Washington? Have you ever read about George Washington? And the orators, look at John Adams, look at Thomas Jefferson, and the mighty man. Look at who wrote the Declaration of Independence. God had these people there. He had these kind of people in the United States, already had gone through the revival that started in 1720. Ben Franklin watched it. Ben Franklin went through the war. Ben Franklin went through quite a bit, and now he's in here talking to the people of the Convention of the Constitution. And I want you to listen to the words he speaks, because he's going to show you the spirit of America, and he's going to remind you of what's in the United States.
Amen.
This is Ben Franklin, and he's talking about the argument that they're having. They're just, some of them are ready to go home. He said, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? He said, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers. He said, sir, we were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And you say God wasn't in the United States.
Amen.
He goes on, and to the kind providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or have we imagined that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate incident, despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers, imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations, be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate at that service. That was Ben Franklin. That was who you call a deist. That was Benjamin Franklin. How many of our forefathers you called a deist? And look at what he says. He said we were here every day praying during the Revolutionary War, and every day praying with the Declaration of Independence, and we need him again. You know, it was seconded by a delegate of Virginia, and they never really did get somebody to pray, a clergyman to come in, because they couldn't decide where the money was going to come from. But you know what? God heard their prayer. God heard his words, and I can no doubt that some of them were praying, because the Monday after, I think he spoke this on the Friday, the Monday after they decided and came up with splitting Congress into a legislature of population and a legislature of the Senate, where 2 came from every state. That was the great compromise, and it didn't come after until Ben Franklin spoke those words. You know, and then the Constitution, they came up with it. They finished it. And our forefathers, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, read it. And you know what they said? It wasn't enough. They said, this is not enough. He said, you have a government. And this was done by many people. Listen, he said, and Rhode Island was in on this, and so was Massachusetts. They said, this is not enough. You have a beautiful balance of power. They had the executive branch, and it was balanced by the judicial branch and the legislative branch, and vice versa. There was a balance. Nobody was going to get stronger than the other. That's the way it was originally set up. Why? Because they knew man.
Amen.
They knew what people were like. So after this, they said it's not enough. And you know what the problem was? They said you have not given the rights of a single individual. He said you have not made it clear the rights of an individual. Can you imagine a people coming together to come up with a government? And the argument is you have to make sure the individual has rights, that they have a freedom to worship. That's where Rhode Island and Massachusetts and some of the other states came in. You have to give the people that are going to live in this United States, this uniting of states, you've got to give them the right to worship the way they see fit. And you don't think God was in this? You don't think he was with the first people that came over here? They're arguing that you have to give them the right to religion, the right to worship the way they saw fit. And there were some other rights that they had to have. And you know, when they started ratifying the Constitution, it took them a couple years to get it ratified, to have 9 people, to have the majority of the 13 colonies so they could go ahead and begin. But you know what was interesting? Massachusetts and Rhode Island held out. In fact, Massachusetts, when they were deliberating in their state chamber, they got into a big fist fight. Yeah, those Puritans, ended up in a big fist fight over it. Rhode Island held out. They said, we're not signing. We are not signing until you make sure that there are state rights rights of the individual. In Rhode Island, in their constitution, they even had rights for the American Indian. The Native Americans, they said that you cannot take land from the Indians. You got to pay for it. That was in the Rhode Island Constitution. And they said, you need to put this in the American Constitution. Oh, it was a big fight. It took 3 years. 3 years. You know, Washington was president for a whole year before Rhode Island finally came in. And the only reason Rhode Island came in was the other states said, if you don't ratify it, we're not going to trade with you. We're not going to buy your products. We're going to kick you out. And you know what? When they voted, it only passed by 2 votes. Just 2. But what they said and what these other states said, they said, we will not ratify it until you put in the Bill of Rights. Until the Bill of Rights is put into the Constitution, we will not ratify it. You wonder where you get your rights? It was from the mighty man, from the great order, from the people that God put there to make sure you had some rights. You know what? There were no other countries that had the rights that we do. And I want to read you, to remind you of what the first right was in the Bill of Rights, because it is still there today. Do you know the Constitution is the longest running document in its entirety that's still working? 241 years, I think, is how old our country is. And the Constitution was from 1787. I want to read you that first article. It says, Bill of Rights, Article 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It says, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's just the first one. all those things in the first article. And we had states that said, we will not ratify the Constitution until you do that. And it was done. It was done the very first day that Congress came together. The very first day that the new government met for the first time, the first thing they did was they ratified the Bill of Rights. And I want to say something about George Washington. George Washington was our first president. Did you know he didn't want to be president? He didn't want to be president at all. In fact, when they came to him, he was back home, back where he wanted to be. And they came to him, they said, we need you back in Congress. We need you in the government. And he said, haven't I done enough? He said, haven't I done enough? He was the general during the Revolutionary War. The man gave all his fortune. You know, when the United States first began, we didn't have a currency. Washington went home and emptied his house of all his silver so we could make coins. That was Washington. They came back to him and said, we don't have anybody else that can be president and run this country the way it needs to begin. Washington was not only the man of war that led us through the Revolutionary War, he was our first president. You know what's interesting about Washington? They could have made him king. They liked him so much they wanted to make him king. He said, no way. No way. In fact, he made sure that when we talked about our president, he made sure we did not call him Majesty, Your Majesty. He said, oh, no, no, you call me Mr. President. That's all. And when his second term was done, they wanted to make him president again. He said, no, no. He went home. He said, it's time now for somebody else's job. He was the precedent for our presidency, the precedent. He showed us how it was done. And who do you think was with him? Who do you think was with Washington? You want to know? There was a great chief that knew who was with Washington. He said about Washington, he said, the Great Spirit's with you. We can't kill you. We tried and we couldn't kill you. He said, I know the Great Spirit is with you. God was with this country. Benjamin Franklin proved it in his speech. That is how the Constitution got there. America, America, don't forget where you came from. Don't forget who your fathers were. And don't forget who your fathers trusted in. Amen.